Welcome to the Good White Folks Podcast, your trusted source for counter-racism news and analysis. Powered by Planetary Chess and cutting-edge AI, we deliver sharp insights into the state of white supremacy to keep you informed and empowered.
All right, so this week in the news, white supremacy, right, front and center. It feels like it's not even just isolated incidents anymore, like we're seeing patterns, systems. It's a lot.
Yeah, it can be overwhelming for sure.
It really can. But that's what we're here for. We're diving deep today. We want to understand what's going on beneath the surface.
Exactly. And we're going to be using this newsletter called State of White Supremacy News Monitoring. They do some really interesting analysis looking at news through the lens of critical race theory.
Okay, critical race theory.
Yeah.
So we're talking big thinkers here.
Oh, yeah. Drawing on people like Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, Dr. Amos Wilson.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting for me. They have this severity score system.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't know, a Richter scale, but for white supremacy.
Okay, I like that.
It's not just about counting racist incidents, but looking at the impact, the causes, the whole picture. And this week, some stories scored alarmingly high.
Yeah, some really high scores. One story hit 100, a perfect score on their scale. A Trump cabinet pick actually withdrawing after facing backlash from the Medjie movement.
Yeah.
We're going to dig into what that might reveal about the power dynamics within that group.
Yeah, fascinating.
Really is.
Yeah.
Then there's this racist attack on an Indian-American family caught on video. Just the emotional impact is devastating. The newsletter actually connects this to what Dr. Welsing calls a survival response driven by fear, which we'll explain later.
Oh, okay. We'll have to get into that.
And we also can't overlook this potential appointment of a raw milk seller who actually has a history of safety violations as a food safety advisor.
Okay, wait. A raw milk seller with safety violations as a food safety advisor.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem like a great fit.
No, not at first glance. But the newsletter argues that this actually exemplifies how white supremacy can operate through, like, seemingly neutral channels, and who benefits and who suffers from those decisions.
Okay, so let's unpack this severity score a little bit. They say it takes into account the volume, severity, and impact of incidents. They're using both psychological and political economic indicators. What does that actually mean?
So imagine, like, a single instance of hate speech. Horrible, right? But isolated. That might score lower than a trend that seems less severe on the surface, but actually reveals a wider pattern. Think of it like this. A few cracks in a building might not be alarming, but if the foundation is crumbling, that's a different story.
Okay, that's a good analogy. So it's not just about individual incidents. It's about understanding the systemic issues.
Exactly. And that's where the analysis of African scholars becomes so crucial. They help us see the connections.
The deeper dynamics, right?
The deeper dynamics that might otherwise go unnoticed.
Okay, so with that in mind, let's dive into that Trump cabinet pick story, the one that scored 100. What happened?
So this individual seemed to have initial support for a cabinet position. Then articles and social media posts from within the Medjie movement, that's the Make America Great. Again, the slogan associated with Trump and his supporters. They started criticizing his past statements and actions.
Sounds like, I don't know, just typical political maneuvering. What made this a hunter at a car on the white supremacy scale?
Well, the newsletter argues this isn't just an isolated incident. It's about the Medjie movement, using outrage, using pressure tactics to actually control who holds positions of power.
Oh, so they have an agenda.
Exactly. So if a group can dictate who's in or out based on their own specific agenda, that's a huge red flag.
Yeah, I see what you mean. So it's not just about this one person, it's about a strategy, a system.
Precisely. They're saying this is a disturbing pattern of silencing dissenting voices and consolidating power within a specific ideology.
It aligns with white supremacy.
Exactly.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit to that racist attack on the Indian-American family.
Yeah.
This one is just, heartbreaking. That video footage, it shows this family, they're being verbally and physically assaulted just for existing.
It's awful.
It's a stark reminder of the human cost of these ideologies.
It really is. And the newsletter emphasizes this, pointing to the trauma inflicted on the victims. And they argue that this attack is a prime example of what Dr. Welsing calls this survival response.
Okay, hold on. Can we break that down a bit? What does survival response actually mean in this context?
So it's rooted in this idea that white supremacy, at its core, is driven by this fear of genetic annihilation. This fear, according to Dr. Welsing, can lead to aggression, violence against people of color as a way of maintaining dominance, control.
What? So it's not just about like hate or prejudice in a vacuum. It's about this primal fear of being outnumbered and ultimately losing power.
Exactly. And the newsletter argues that incidents like this attack, as horrific as they are, need to be understood within this broader context.
It's not just random anger.
It's rooted in a system of racial dominance and fear.
That's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
It makes you realize how deeply ingrained these anxieties can be.
It really does, and it underscores the importance of listening to the analysis of African scholars like Dr. Welsing, who can help us unpack these complex dynamics.
Okay, so we've seen white supremacy playing out in politics. We've seen it play out in acts of violence. Now let's talk about that raw milk seller being considered for a food safety advisor position.
Right.
How does this seemingly, I don't know, unrelated story connect back to our topic?
So this is where it gets really interesting. The newsletter argues that this potential appointment exemplifies how white supremacy can operate through these seemingly neutral, even bureaucratic channels. This individual has a history of selling contaminated dairy products, putting people's health at risk.
So appointing someone with a track record of, well, negligence, especially when it comes to something as basic as food safety, that could disproportionately harm certain communities.
Exactly. And the newsletter actually connects this to Dr. Amos Wilson's work, which emphasizes how white supremacy isn't just about individual prejudice, but about controlling resources systems. It's about who benefits and who suffers from the decisions made at the highest levels.
So they're suggesting that this appointment, if it goes through, could be a way to perpetuate harm against marginalized communities who are often most vulnerable to these kinds of risks. It's a way of maintaining control through policy rather than outright aggression.
Precisely. And it's a reminder that we need to be paying attention to these seemingly unrelated events and asking critical questions. Who benefits from this? Who is being harmed? And how do these decisions reinforce existing systems of inequality?
We're starting to see a pattern emerge here, aren't we? White supremacy isn't always blatant. It can be woven into the fabric of our institutions and our policies.
Absolutely. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. The newsletter highlights several other high-scoring stories from this week that are worth discussing. One that stood out to me involves the racist backlash against the casting of Lee Jung-jae in the new Star Wars series, The Acolyte.
Oh, wow, Star Wars. Another example of how these seemingly isolated incidents can actually reveal much deeper patterns.
Exactly. This backlash wasn't just about one actor or one show. It was a manifestation of a broader resistance to diversity and inclusion in pop culture. The newsletter frames this within the concept of symbolic warfare. It's about controlling the narrative, maintaining a white-centric worldview, and pushing back against anything that challenges that.
So the casting of a non-white actor in a major franchise is perceived as a threat, even in a fictional context.
Right. And it's important to note that this isn't just about entertainment. The images and stories we consume shape our understanding of the world, our values, our beliefs.
So when those images are consistently white-dominated,
It reinforces the idea of white superiority.
it makes you realize how much power representation holds. Okay, another high-scoring story that caught my eye was a Justice Department investigation revealing serious misconduct by the Memphis Police Department. This one seems to highlight the institutional level of white supremacy.
Absolutely. The investigation uncovered a pattern of racial profiling, excessive force, even planting evidence. It's a stark reminder of how white supremacy can be embedded within law enforcement, within the criminal justice system.
Which, again, the newsletter connects to Dr. Wilson's analysis.
Right.
He emphasizes how white supremacy maintains power through control of institutions and resources.
It's true. The police, the courts, the prisons, these are all systems that have historically been used to oppress and control people of color.
And these systems don't exist in isolation.
No. They're interconnected with education, housing, healthcare. It creates this web of systemic racism that impacts almost every aspect of our lives. It's overwhelming, but understanding these connections is crucial if we want to even begin dismantling white supremacy.
It's a lot to take in, for sure. But I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of these stories.
Oh, yeah.
What other insights can we glean from this week's newsletter?
Well, we focused on some of the most alarming incidents, but the newsletter also highlights instances of resistance and calls to action from African scholars and activists. It's not all doom and gloom. There are people actively fighting back against white supremacy, and their voices are being heard.
Okay, that's good to hear. We need those voices. We definitely need those voices right now. Let's delve into some of those stories of resistance when we return in part 2 of this deep dive.
You're right. There are definitely some glimmers of hope in all of this. The newsletter doesn't just focus on in the negative, it also highlights these stories of resistance activism analysis from African scholars and activists.
Okay, so give me an example. What kind of stories are we talking about?
Well, one that caught my eye was about the Boston City Council. They're looking to mandate that ordinances and budgets be based on racial and social equity.
That's a big deal. Using the power of the purse to address systemic inequities? I like it.
Yeah.
What does the newsletter say about this?
They see it as a prime example of how to challenge white supremacy through institutions. It's not just acknowledging the problem, it's taking concrete steps to redistribute resources and power in a way that actually benefits marginalized communities.
So instead of just talking about racism, they're trying to actually do something about it. What else?
Another story that resonated with me was about the confirmation of Sparkle Suknanen. She's a civil rights champion as a federal judge. This is a significant victory, not only for representation, but also for the potential to have a judge who understands the complexities of the systemic racism and can really advocate for justice within the legal system.
That's huge. Having someone like Sparkle Suknan in a position of authority sends a message that those voices and experiences are valued.
Exactly. And the newsletter highlights how this appointment directly challenges the historical dominance of white men in the judiciary, which has been a key pillar of white supremacy.
It's definitely a step in the right direction.
Hmm.
You mentioned earlier that the newsletter features analysis from African scholars. How are they interpreting these events?
Well, the newsletter frequently cites the work of Dr. Cornel West. He's a prominent philosopher and activist. He emphasizes the importance of maintaining spiritual and moral integrity in the face of these oppressive systems.
So in a way, he's saying we can't let the negativity drag us down. We have to hold on to our values and principles.
Precisely. He's calling for a resistance that's not just political, but also spiritual and ethical. Another scholar the newsletter often quotes is Dr. Ajamu Baraka, a political activist and analyst.
I'm familiar with Dr. Baraka's work. He's very outspoken about the need for radical systemic change. What's his take on the current situation?
Dr. Baraka argues that what we're seeing is a symptom of a much deeper crisis of white supremacy and capitalism. He's calling for a movement that goes beyond just voting and addresses the root causes of injustice.
So he's pushing for a more fundamental transformation of society, not just tweaking the existing system.
Yes. He believes that incremental reforms are not enough to address the deep-seated inequities in our society. And feminist scholars like Dr. Bell Hooks and Angela Davis, who are often featured in the newsletter, emphasize the intersectionality of race, gender, and class. They argue that we can't address racism without also dismantling patriarchy and economic exploitation.
That's a crucial point. We can't separate these issues. They're all intertwined.
Exactly.
Right.
And by bringing in these diverse voices and perspectives, the newsletter provides a much richer understanding of the complexities of both white supremacy and the resistance to it.
It's not just a one-sided narrative. They're presenting a range of viewpoints and interpretations, which is what makes it so valuable.
Absolutely. It encourages critical thinking and challenges us to consider different ways of seeing the world.
It's not just about agreeing with everything they say. It's about engaging with the ideas and deepening our own understanding.
And that's what makes this deep dive so exciting. We're not just passively consuming information, we're grappling with it, making connections, and hopefully coming away with a more sophisticated understanding of what's going on.
So we've talked about institutional change, the role of the courts, and we've explored the insights of African scholars. It's clear the newsletter paints a picture of a multifaceted struggle against white supremacy. What other aspects are they highlighting?
They also emphasize the importance of cultural resistance. For example, there's a story about the movie Wicked sparking outrage among some Trump supporters for allegedly portraying white people as dumb and evil.
Hold on, really? Wicked?
Yeah, it's interesting. While the newsletter article itself focuses on the movie being accused of racism and appropriation, it also uses this as an example of how cultural narratives can become battlegrounds in the fight against white supremacy.
It's fascinating how something as seemingly innocuous as a movie can become so politically charged.
Right. And the newsletter points out that this sensitivity to criticism, even in a fictional context, reveals a certain fragility within the white supremacist worldview. Even subtle challenges can be perceived as a threat.
So by pushing back against these narratives and creating art that challenges the status quo, we can chip away at the foundation of white supremacy.
Exactly. And the newsletter also highlights the role of music in promoting social justice. There was a story about Courtney Love, who faced criticism for her past racist remarks while praising Kendrick Lamar. This sparked a discussion about the role of white artists in amplifying Black voices and challenging racism within the music industry.
It's a good reminder that allyship isn't just about words, it's about actions. Using your platform to elevate marginalized voices and challenge systems of oppression.
And acknowledging your own privilege and using it to dismantle those systems.
Now, the newsletter keeps referencing Dr. Welsing's color confrontation theory and Dr. Wilson's political economic analysis. Can we break down those frameworks a bit more?
Absolutely. Dr. Welsing's theory argues that white supremacy is rooted in this deep-seated fear of genetic annihilation. Because white people are a global minority, they feel threatened by the growing number of people of color.
That's interesting. So it's not just about hate or prejudice, it's about a fear of being outnumbered and ultimately replaced.
Right. And this fear, according to Dr. Welsing, can manifest in a variety of ways, from violence and intimidation to more subtle forms of control, like manipulating institutions and cultural narratives.
And how does Dr. Wilson's political economic analysis fit into this?
Dr. Wilson argues that white supremacy isn't just about psychology, it's also about material conditions. It's about controlling resources, wealth, and power.
So it's about maintaining a system where white people are at the top of the economic and social hierarchy.
Exactly. And this system is perpetuated through discriminatory laws, policies, and exploitative labor practices.
It's a powerful combination of psychological and material forces that work to maintain white dominance.
Absolutely. And the newsletter uses these frameworks to analyze current events, revealing the hidden workings of white supremacy in everything from politics to pop culture.
It's a pretty intense way to look at the news, but it's also incredibly insightful. It helps you see things in a whole new light.
It does. It challenges us to move beyond surface-level interpretations and delve into the deeper systemic roots of racism and injustice.
And ultimately, that's what we're trying to do here on the Deep Dive, right? To help our listeners become more informed and engaged.
Absolutely. We're providing tools and insights to help people navigate a complex and often confusing world.
And hopefully inspire them to take action for a more just and equitable society.
Speaking of taking action, there's one more story from the newsletter I think is crucial to discuss: the efforts to address maternal health disparities, particularly among Black women.
That's a critical issue. Black women are far more likely to die during childbirth than white women. It's a stark example of how racism can have real devastating consequences.
Exactly. And the newsletter highlights a bill in Michigan aimed at tackling these disparities by expanding access to prenatal care, improving data collection, and addressing implicit bias in healthcare.
It's good to see that there are people working to address these systemic issues, but I'm curious, how does the newsletter connect this back to white supremacy?
They argue that these disparities are a direct result of historical and ongoing racism in healthcare. Black women have been systematically denied access to quality care, and their pain and concerns are often dismissed.
So it's not just about individual acts of prejudice. It's about a system that devalues Black lives and puts Black women at risk.
Exactly. And they connect this back to Dr. Wilson's analysis of political and economic control. By denying Black women access to healthcare, the system weakens their communities, limits their opportunities, and ultimately maintains white dominance.
It's a sobering reminder that the fight against white supremacy is about much more than just overt discrimination. It's about challenging systems that perpetuate inequity and harm, even in areas like healthcare.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing the interconnectedness of these issues and working to dismantle the web of oppression that binds them together.
This is heavy stuff. But I feel like there's even more to unpack. We've only just begun to explore the insights from this week's newsletter. Let's take a breath and dive back in with even more analysis in part 3 of this deep dive.
You know, going through these stories, one thing that keeps popping up is this concept of white fragility.
Yeah, we touched on it a little with that whole wicked thing.
Right.
But remind me, what does that actually mean in this context?
So it's this idea that even the slightest pushback against white dominance can trigger this really defensive reaction, often way out of proportion to, like, whatever the perceived offense was.
Okay, yeah, I'm starting to remember. Like that whole Alyssa Milano thing.
Exactly.
Where she deleted her ex account after getting backlash for, I think it was a tweet about buying a Volkswagen.
Yeah, that's the one. The newsletter uses this as like a prime example of how white fragility plays out online. Milano, you know, a white celebrity, she faces all this criticism for seemingly criticizing Tesla, which a lot of people associate with a certain segment of, well, white America.
Right, and instead of engaging in a conversation or pushing back, she just dips out.
Exactly. And the newsletter argues that this withdrawal actually reinforces the power dynamics of white fragility. By silencing herself, Milano inadvertently validated the outrage and avoided actually confronting the issues of race and privilege head-on.
It shows that allyship takes more than just good intentions. You have to be willing to have tough conversations and stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable.
And that discomfort, that defensiveness, is what the newsletter really wants us to unpack. Why do these seemingly minor critiques trigger such strong reactions?
Right. It goes back to Dr. Welsing's theory, right? That deep-seated fear of losing power and control.
Precisely. And when that fear is activated, it can manifest in a lot of ways. Anger, denial, silencing dissent, even violence.
It's like a constant defense mechanism, protecting their position at the top.
Which leads us to another important theme the newsletter highlights: the need for white people to actively dismantle white supremacy.
So it's not enough to just be not racist.
No. You have to actually work to undo the system.
Okay, how?
Well, the newsletter offers some concrete examples of what that looks like. It highlights stories about white activists working alongside communities of color to challenge police brutality, reform the criminal justice system, promote economic justice.
It's a good reminder that allyship is a journey, not a destination. It requires constant self-reflection, education, a willingness to challenge your own biases and assumptions.
And a willingness to cede power, cede privilege, to create space for marginalized voices and to center the needs of those who are most impacted by systemic racism.
Wow. We've covered some heavy stuff in this deep dive, but I think we've gained a much deeper understanding of how white supremacy is showing up today.
I agree. The newsletter, with its focus on critical race theory and the perspectives of African scholars, has given us a powerful lens to really understand what's happening.
It's not just about reporting incidents. It's about analyzing the root causes, the psychological and political economic forces at play. It's about understanding the different perspectives, the different approaches to resistance and change.
And it's about connecting these seemingly separate events and recognizing the patterns, the systems that perpetuate white supremacy.
So what does this all mean for our listeners? What do you hope they take away from this deep dive?
I hope they come away with a renewed sense of urgency, a deeper understanding of the complexities of racism, and a commitment to challenging white supremacy in all its forms.
And I hope they're inspired to check out these sources themselves, to keep learning, keep engaging in these critical conversations.
Because knowledge is power. And the more we understand about these systems, the better equipped we are to dismantle them.
Absolutely. We've included links to all the articles in our show notes, so make sure to check those out. And as always, we encourage you to share your thoughts and reflections with us. What stood out to you? What questions do you have?
This is just the beginning of the conversation.
And remember, the fight for racial justice is a marathon, not a sprint. We have to stay engaged, informed, and committed to creating a world where everyone can thrive, regardless of their race.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep fighting for a better future.
Thank you for tuning in to the Good White Folks podcast. Be sure to visit us at planetarychess.org to explore more content and subscribe to our monthly newsletter. For those who want to stay ahead, join our paid tier for just $10 a month and receive daily State of White Supremacy alerts, Monday through Friday. Stay informed, stay empowered, and let's dismantle together.